Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm here today with Dr. AKM Adam. He is a lecturer at Oriel College, Oxford, and Associate Priest at St. Helen's, Abingdon. And I'm here to ask some questions about New Testament Christology and specifically some areas of Trinitarian theology. So I'll just jump straight into my first question, which is, how do you understand the Gospel of John's overt Christological claims, especially in the prologue and I am sayings, against the more implicit narrative-based portrayals of Christ's divinity in the Synoptics?
So there are several dimensions to the question you ask, and I have to split them apart if you'll indulge me. So with regard to the preface, it's debatable the extent to which the preface is integral to the Gospel of John. A number of scholars take the preface and various other bits of John to be agglomerated into one longer Gospel. I'm not a John specialist, partly because there are so many topics like the source criticism of John that just whirl around one another. And if you say, well, I think it all belongs together, then you have to figure out why X, Y, and Z. For instance, the Christology of the preface tends not to come back explicitly in the whole rest of the gospel, which is a little tricky to explain if you think this is the evangelist's opening salvo, and he wants to impress on you that this is how things are with Jesus. But then he drops the vocabulary and diction of the preface and modulates into a different register for the rest of the gospel. I just look at problems like that and say, I'll leave that to John specialists. That said, the Christology of the first verse is tough to argue with. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was proximate to God, and the Word was God. Boom. Now, Jesus is never identified with the Word explicitly in John's Gospel. So in the preface, towards the end of the preface, in verses 14 and 18 especially, John makes it clear that this refers back to Jesus. But as I say, in the rest of the Gospel from then on, no one says, that guy is the Word, or the Word is manifest among us, or something along those lines. That whole pivotal affirmation of the divinity of the Word just goes by the boards, or perhaps John wants us to take it as a subcurrent over which the rest of the Gospel plays. But that's very explicit. The I am sayings are trickier. I am an I am deflationist. So you've got two different kinds of I am sayings, just in general. Pretty much everyone agrees that when Jesus says things like, I am the bread of life, I am the way, the truth, the life, I am the vine, I am the gate of the sheep, I am the good shepherd, that's just saying, I am X, Y, Z, the way I am a lecturer at Oriel, you are I don't know whether it's still called a podcast if it's video. We used to have arguments about whether there should be vodcasting or something along those lines, but that's you. So we parcel those off to the side, and then there are what people call the absolute I am sayings. So before Abraham was, I am, and the people who come to arrest Jesus in the garden say, Jesus says, "Who are you looking for?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I am," and everyone falls over. There are more than those, but those are two of the key examples. Now, the catch is that in reading the phrase "ego eimi" in Greek, "I am," one can read that as "I am," but one can also read, for instance, "it is I." If, who's there? "Ego eimi," it is I. That's, there's nothing about claiming divinity involved in that. So if one wants to examine the absolute sayings, to my mind, it's necessary to ask a question. It's a little tricky to phrase it for compressed purposes, but it goes like this. The more everyday, the more vanilla a particular usage is, the more it has to be amped up, the more it has to be highlighted and emphasized in particular ways in order to cue a reader or a listener that it's being used in an unusual way. So, for instance, now I'm not thinking of anything would be, but if John wants his readers, his listeners, to understand that Jesus is making a claim about his divinity by saying, "I am," he doesn't give contextual clues to say, here he's saying, "I am" in a divine sense, rather than just, "It's me." This is also typically associated with preachers' fondness for claiming that Jesus, "ego eimi," in John's Gospel refers to the revelation of the divine name in Exodus 3. But that's not the way the Greek Bible reads in Exodus. In Exodus 3, Moses wants to know the divine name, and when the burning bush speaks to him, he says, the bush says, "Ego eimi ha'on," which is the participial form of the verb of being. I am the one I am the being one. I am being, or something like that. So that the "ego eimi" in that phrase isn't the divine name itself. Mm-hmm. It's saying, I'm ha'on. So if John the Evangelist is reading Exodus, the relevant divine name would be ha'on, the being one, which Jesus doesn't use in John's Gospel anyway. Now, a very clever professor in Wales, Catherine Williams, has done her homework and shown that in the book of the prophet Isaiah, there are a number of places where the divine name is evoked or used, where the Greek uses a repeated formula, "ego eimi," so that her claim is that John's resting not on Exodus, but on Isaiah. To which my response is, that's great, and in fact, I could be brought to agree to it. But Isaiah is a long book, 66 chapters. The number of passages in which this occurs, at a maximum, I would agree to about 6, and that's at a maximum. 6 uses of a very vanilla phrase, ego eimi, in a book of 66 chapters. For John the Evangelist to expect a reader to pick up, that's what he's saying. I just don't see the basis in John's written gospel for him cueing the reader to think that way.
Yes.
So I tend not to count that. Now, she's an expert on this. As I say, she's done just painstakingly detailed work, and she's confident that this goes. But this is biblical studies, Jack, and all of us are confident that we're right. So with all the respect in the world for Professor Williams and her work on this, and she is, I'll say, preeminent on this topic, I still haven't been convinced that there's enough of an oomph there to read the expression in John as something other than Jesus saying, that's me. I've been around since Abraham, or something along those lines, but not an invocation of the divine name.
Yes. Yeah. If I can just go back a little bit to the opening of John.
Yeah.
I've heard some objections to the phrase, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard particularly Jehovah's Witnesses add the word a, the Word was a God.
Or some people read it as the Word was divine.
Is that a valid translation of the Greek? Or would you say
I would not, is it valid? Language is a fluid thing. John could have written it that way, meaning to say the Word was of God. Is that the most likely? No, not by any means, I would say. Is it possible? Sure. He may even have just made a grammatical mistake. There are grammatical mistakes in the New Testament which make it all the more difficult for us to be quite sure whatever anything might be signifying. But the most likely reading should be the Word was God, or I can go along with the argument that it's the Word was divine. But I don't think there's a strong case to be made for the Word was a God as opposed to the big God. Especially just in the language of the verse itself, echoing the beginning of Genesis 1.
Yes.
So if you're going to do that and then sort of backtrack and say, but he's just one of a crowd or something like that, it seems implausible to me.
Do you see, earlier on I think you sort of touched on this idea that there might not be as clear a distinction between the Synoptics and John in regards to their Christology as some claim. Do you see that there is a distinction there still?
Oh sure, absolutely. And each among the Synoptics seems to have its own impress on Christology. Although there are differences of emphasis more than in any sense, antagonistic, warring Christologies or something along those lines. In relation to this and a great many of the other questions you suggested to me, I think it's important that we not assume that questions that seem natural and important to us will have been present to the imagination of the evangelists and apostles in the same way. If I were to say to you, so do you stream video on TikTok or Instagram? You would know what I was talking about, and you'd probably have a preference one way or another, or you say, no, I don't do either of those, or something like that. But if I had asked you that 15 years ago, you might have said, TikTok? I'm not sure when Instagram got started, but it wasn't much. It might not even have been there. If I had said that, you would have been puzzled about what these options even are. We have been repeating creeds, arguing with other people about doctrinal statements for so long that it seems natural and obvious to us that the evangelists, the people around Jesus himself, might have been preoccupied with the same kinds of questions. But I think it's much more likely that everyone was puzzled to a greater or lesser extent. Nobody had clearly marked, bright line distinctions in view, in play, so that the Gospels, the epistles, are way stations towards the kinds of questions about the Trinity, about Christology, that aren't already there. And in fact, it's not even a rail with tracks that you progress to and fro, or you might take a spur line or something like that. But rather, it's a big open field that you want to get across. And you might walk this way, you might think that's getting close to the river, it might be marshy, so I'll tack over this direction, and so on, without a clear sense of where you're going to come out on the other side of the field, or why you've gone exactly the way you have in the first place. So, for instance, in John's Gospel, there's a moment where the crowd asks Jesus, what are you talking about? Who is this Son of Man? Now, maybe they're saying, we know what the Son of Man is. Who is he? But it's also quite possible that they're saying, why are you talking about this Son of Man? Who are you? What do you mean by this phrase? This would go along well with a lot of the puzzlement that attends the question of Jesus' use of Son of Man, and the evangelist's own peculiarly restrictive use, so that only Jesus uses that designation, but he seems to use it in 3 or 4 different senses. It's used in Acts, quoting, I believe, if I'm wrong on this, please note that I'm hesitating on it. I'm old, and some of the page numbers have been obscured over the years. But the rule is that it's not something that St. Paul says, well, of course, the Son of Man, or Jude, or First Peter or something else. Matthew doesn't say Jesus was the Son of Man and this means that, or something along those lines. Its usage is mysterious. There's a lovely compendium of essays on the Son of Man that came out about five or 7 years ago, the Son of Man problem or the Son of Man debate, with probably 40 or 50 essays through time of arguments people have made concerning the usage of Son of Man. And we're not closer to resolving the problem than we were then. So to get back to your question, I read the New Testament texts relative to the Christologies that we end up with as experiments, thought experiments in a way. If we think about Jesus in this way, where does it take us? Or Jesus must have been this kind of guy, so that would go with, but not the way, if you're making a film in Hollywood, especially if it's a superhero film or something along those lines, there are rules. A franchise will have rules. Captain Kirk can never do X, Y, or Z. Mr. Spock will always There aren't those rules for Jesus in the New Testament. We infer those rules on the basis of the New Testament and subsequent deliberation by the Church Fathers. But I don't think there's any place in the New Testament where we get clear-cut, crystalline example of someone saying, I apprehend the Christological or Trinitarian truth, and I'm writing this as an expression of it. If so, if there were, it would be difficult to understand why it took 300 years for the fathers actually to settle on the relevant definitions, 300 years or more in some cases.
In regards specifically to the authorship of John,
yes,
and the date it was written in, or approximately written in, how sure can we be in regards to when it was written, and how do you think this is important in terms of how we read John and how much weight we give it in comparison to the Synoptics?
When we read a text, we can't help imagining a source for that text, whom we can call an author. Maybe it was an editor who compiled it, whatever. But it would take a very distinctive and deliberately disruptive kind of composition to make you think, hey, wait a minute, authorship of this text has changed at this point, or something along those lines. So when we read John, we kind of imagine a John. We can't help it. So it does make a difference how we imagine this John. Do we imagine him as one of the guys who, with Peter and James, was very close to Jesus, followed him around a lot, and was on the inside of a lot of the events? Do we imagine him as an eyewitness, as the text of the gospel wants to underscore? He saw these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Do we imagine John as the one who compiled a set of traditions? Perhaps there are some fragmentary gospel elements, and the John who gives us John's gospel is the one who said, well, we've been using this poetic section about Jesus for years now. We're going to start with that. That's snazzy. It's a bang-up opener. And then we're going to have some of the stories about him, but about half of the gospel is going to be Jesus just talking. As an after-dinner speaker, Jesus in John's gospel is not necessarily who you want. He keeps saying, at one point he says, arise, let's go, and then he sits back down again and starts talking for another 3 chapters. So maybe John, as an author, editor, compiler, composer, is working with sources. Maybe he just wrote it down as he perceived and remembered it. The difficulty with John is that although there are lots of little clues about which of these alternatives is the most persuasive, there's none that's really a knockout that would give us leverage to say, I'm right and you're wrong, and we know that he fits into the first century as this character with these characteristics and this knowledge at this point in history. Most scholars date John from the end of the first century, partly because he has, as we noted, a very high Christology, divine Christology. Although there's been a lot of energy lately devoted to pointing out that some of the early sources also have arguably a divine Christology. Paul, Mark. So that doesn't necessitate John being late. He seems to be generally acquainted with the Synoptic Gospels, but not, he's not working from them literally the way that Matthew and Luke seem to be working from Mark. That would go with a late date for John, requiring not just that he be later than Matthew and Luke, but also that he be later than Mark, since both Matthew and Luke have to be later than Mark to have used Mark. So it's a sort of third literary generation. But there are odd things about John. The absence of a Last Supper scene at which Jesus institutes the Eucharist. Now, if it's in the 90s, as people often suppose, then deliberately omitting a Eucharistic scene at that juncture seems a very peculiar thing for John to have done. Now, he has a Eucharistic discourse, bread of life discourse, earlier in the Gospel. Is he then saying, don't listen to those other characters who tried to tell you that there's that Jesus instituted the Eucharist at the Last Supper? Instead, he used these figures of speech to talk about his body and blood. But at the Last Supper, what he did was to wash the feet of the apostles. That would be an odd thing, and it would be easy to explain if John was in fact very early, such that Eucharistic traditions were still somewhat inchoate. But that conflicts with various other characteristics of John that do push towards a late date. And as I say, this is the kind of reason that I'm not a John specialist, that one has to enter this world and deal with so many variables all at the same time, all of them intertwined with one another, that I like staying over with my Synoptic Gospels where things are tamer.
Yes, and so to sum up on this sort of section in the interview, it seems that you're saying that John is largely complementary with the Synoptics in terms of its Christology, rather than being hugely corrective or...
I don't know. My friend Mark Goodacre, professor at Duke University, is finalizing a manuscript on John's use of the Synoptics. He gave lectures in Oxford several years ago that made the case in a way that seemed more persuasive than I had thought that argument was before. And when I see his manuscript, I may change my mind. One of the great intellectual thrills is encountering the preponderance of evidence displayed in a way that makes you say, I have thought the opposite for 20, 30 years, but by golly, you've convinced me. That's so exciting. And Mark did this for me at the very beginning of my career, when I still thought that that Matthew and Luke used a second source in common besides Mark. And Mark Goodacre, Professor Goodacre, argued no, that Mark came first. Matthew wrote, incorporated Mark and expanded upon it, and Luke came along and said, Matthew's gospel is good, but it really needs to be rearranged significantly, and I've got some other things that belong in there. He changed my mind about that as well, so it would be fitting if at the end of my teaching career, he convinces me of another difference from what I had supposed all along.
Yeah. Okay, well, I know we've touched on the Trinity quite a lot already, but
sure,
I'm going to go into some more direct questions. Firstly, in terms of the gospel narratives, do you feel they offer a proto-Trinitarian structure, especially in terms of events like Jesus' baptism and the transfiguration?
Those are not the two that I would have chosen. They're the obvious standouts there. If you're going to argue for the beginnings of Trinitarian thought, the locus classicus in the Synoptic Gospels is the Great Commission for St. Matthew, baptizing in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Now, I'm not ready to suggest that this reflects what we come to think of as the Trinity, but I also think that once you write those three names, designations in parallel with one another in that way, that advances towards the development of Trinitarian doctrine so significantly that that's where I would put my stakes down if I were staking out a launch pad in the Synoptic Gospels. So, for instance, the baptism, the presence of the Holy Spirit, the words from heaven, are amenable to Trinitarian thought. Once you've got the Trinity in your mind, you look at them and say, well, there you are. But if we didn't have articulated Trinitarian thought nearly 2 millennia's worth and just read that, I'm not sure that we would think of, for instance, the descent of the Holy Spirit on him like a dove as implying a kind of divinity to the Holy Spirit. If you imagine, we look at the Transfiguration narrative and we don't say that it's the Trinity, Elijah, Moses, and Jesus. No, that's clearly wrong. That couldn't be it. Well, what narrative logic makes it more necessary that the Father in heaven and a dove and Jesus form a significant divine triangle, as it were, rather than Jesus, Elijah, and Moses, or some other set of three? Again, it's because retrospectively, we know how the right answer comes out in the Nicene Church. But we can't imagine, I would argue, what it will have been like to be dealing with the concepts of Jesus' sonship, the idea of God as Father in general, Father of Jesus in particular, the Holy Spirit, where did that come from and what does it imply about anything? That all is still so fluid in the first century on my reading that it is risky to concretize, to reify the ultimate outcome as though that were intrinsic in the narratives of the three Synoptic Gospels.
I've got a question which might take a little bit to flesh out, sort of thing. When you're talking about maybe the Trinity isn't as obvious in the text with a blind reading, how do you then view, in terms of normative requirements for salvation, would you say that Trinitarian theology should be seen as absolutely required for salvation, given that perhaps it relies on a certain interpretation of the text? Would you say that someone who, say, accepts modalism, which I know is a heresy, but still is accepting the divinity of Christ in some sense, would you say that that prevents them from attaining salvation, at least in the normative sense?
This is above my pay grade, as they say. I do not decide who gets saved or who doesn't. The Church says in the Athanasian Creed, if you would be saved, and then gives a variety of stipulations. I'm not smarter than St. Athanasius, and I'm not smarter than whoever came up with the Athanasius Creed, which I'm not assuming is exactly the same thing as St. Athanasius. And I'm not prescribing to the Savior just whom the Savior will be saving. As he says in John's Gospel, I have other sheep not of this fold. So he may be calling other sheep who don't know anything about modalism. We have plenty of people within the Church whose adherence to Trinitarian nuance is only tenuous, if in fact there's much of it at all. These are good, faithful people who trust Jesus, who trust God, but who, if you pinned them down and threatened them with torture instruments, would not be able to say anything vaguely resembling articulated Trinitarian doctrine. I'm not worried about their salvation. if someone says, I want to be sure that I'm in the right on the Trinity, I would say, well, insofar as I know, all I know is what the church teaches, and the church teaches these things. If someone said, I refuse to believe that, then I would say, well, you're taking the risk that this is inconsequential. You're judging yourself to be wiser than the theologians who've given us this definition. It seems like an unnecessary risk to me, but if you want to be in communion, if you're willing to subordinate your skepticism to the church's faith, then so be it. But again, I don't deal in who gets saved and who doesn't.
Would you say that a rejection of Jesus' divinity marks a completely different theological standpoint?
I wouldn't understand why someone who doesn't think of Jesus as divine would want to participate in the life of a church whose premise, whose pivotal, nearly universal premise is that, in fact, he was. If such a person wants to be part of the church, wants to stand among people who are saying, we believe God of God, light of light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, and they're saying, well, then I would take it that the Holy Spirit is binding the heart of such a person despite the resistance of their intellect. I would not want them to go around telling people that at St. Helen's this or that is optional, or I go to St. Helen's and I don't believe any of that nonsense, or something along those lines. But I think a lot of what has come to be bound up with the verb believe in English has lost its bearings after the Reformation, perhaps even earlier, to refer to a sort of teeth-gritting determination that this is true in a way that I don't think any of us, apart from the illumination of the Holy Spirit, have the equipment to know whether it's true. I mean, this is a revealed thing. And revelation is not something that happens in a binary or a digital peg into slot kind of way, but it's always for practically all of us, I'll say. I don't mean to say anything about the Pope or inspired authors or something like that, but for most of us it's always a more or less. Yes. Plus, I'm much more interested in the believing that a life bespeaks. So, for instance, I believe in gravity. Yeah. Do I think about gravity? Hardly ever. Mostly just when the issue of believing comes up, because then I use it as an example. But in my life, I do not walk off the edge of precipices. I actually work to cultivate my sense of balance because I don't like falling over. I'm careful on staircases. All of those seem to me to signify that I believe in the power of gravity. Much more vividly than if I were to say, I believe in gravity, or if I were in a sort of obscurantist kind of way to say, well, I don't believe in gravity. Well, if you don't do these risky things, it seems to me that you probably do believe in gravity, whether you're willing to admit it or not. Likewise, a life lived on a pattern revealed and communicated by Christ through the church. Whether someone says, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and of Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived under or who says, that's all just balderdash. I would want to take the testimony of the life at least as seriously as the words uttered.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So believing in a much more comprehensive sense seems less amenable to the kinds of, well, it would be derogatory to say hair splitting, because these hairs are important and some of them need to be divided. So I'm not making fun, but the kinds of distinctions that I rely on, made by physicists, mathematicians, chemists, and so on, when I take prescription drugs or fly in an airplane, I'm expressing my faith that all the relevant people have done the engineering and safety checks and so on. So too with religious faith, to my mind, that if I'm living in a way that very clearly points to the church and the cross of Christ, the power of the risen Christ, then I think that that's probably as eloquent a belief claim as anything I could say in words.
Yeah. Okay. I did a poll on my YouTube channel where I sort of asked my audience their stance religiously within Christianity.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be helpful to address one of, I think, the key disagreements with the Trinity in relation to Christ's obedience to the Father.
Yeah.
And perhaps briefly touching on the topic of kenosis and this sort of self-emptying.
Okay.
How do we reconcile Christ's divinity and co-eternality, co-substantiality with the Father with this obedience in his earthly ministry?
This gets at some of the very fine hairs that the patristic scholars, the fathers themselves and subsequent scholars have refined to the point of microscopy in splitting. Again, I'm a New Testament guy, so I am out of my depth in, if I were to claim to any authority in my answer. But as the simple man that I am, my understanding is that in undertaking full humanity, Christ undertakes perfect obedience to the Father's will, not in the sense of a sort of robotic enactment of programming, but rather in the revealed sense of knowing that this is his vocation, his life unto the cross. For him to have access to all of the divine knowledge all the time. In the first place, that's contraindicated when you say full humanity, because human beings don't have that equipment. We don't. We can't. So there must be some extent to which the humanity of Christ is fulfilled in voluntary, when you're talking about God, using the word necessary, it seems massively presumptuous, and I wouldn't. But you mentioned kenosis. In taking on human identity, it seems concomitant with humanity that there be at least a penumbra of uncertainty or ambiguity about perception that affects his daily life and conduct, such that it doesn't affect his fidelity to his calling, the faithfulness of Christ about which Paul speaks, which ultimately leads him to the cross. Now, the Gospels take different views of this. John is much more confident in Jesus' assurance and confident undertaking of execution. And Mark, to take the diametric alternative, seems to show Jesus very reluctant to go to the cross. I'm not sure there's a plausible way of holding those two together as they stand. So if one takes Mark as expressing the fullness of humanity, so I'm not getting crucified, thank you very much. And John is expressing the fullness of divinity. So be it. This is how things will be. And after all, I know that it's for the disciples' good that I go away, because that will enable the presence of the Paraclete, the Spirit. So I'll just do it as an expression of the the fullness of divinity, and then take Matthew and Luke as mediating those to some extent. I think that if we understand Jesus to have had an undeviating commitment to obedience, even to the point of the cross, which in Mark's case, he does submit, even so, not my will, but yours be done. With varying degrees of unclarity about just how that plays out. That seems like the best explanation of the full divinity and full humanity of Jesus, though being in the form of God, not counting equality with God as something to be clung to. It would be one way of saying it, but self-emptying, taking on the form of a slave, the lowest form of humanity in that ideological world. I think something like that has to be the explanation that someone such as I would go with.
On a similar note, I think some may say that given the enormity of the truth claim of Jesus being God, I was speaking to someone earlier today about this, would it be fair to say that Jesus doesn't speak very explicitly or clearly of his divine nature and in what way this nature operates?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's, again, in John, where he's most clear about this kind of thing, he says, the Father and I are one, I am doing the Father's works. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But it's very clear that it's not the case that Andrew, looking at Jesus, says, oh, so the Father is, maybe got a beard. I happen to think that having a beard is a mark of divinity, but it's open to question. About yea, tall, so on and so forth. I would have a hard time thinking that that's what Jesus meant. That's what John meant to represent Jesus as meaning. But rather that by observing Jesus, his characteristics, his love, his power for healing, his wisdom, his commitment to the path set before him, that one sees the characteristics of the Father. That seems entirely right and appropriate.
Of course, as you've mentioned, all of these topics are sort of up to debate, but
absolutely.
In terms of the intentions of the authors of the Gospels, and particularly John, would you say that we can largely assume that they did have a higher Christology?
Mark seems to me to have had a Christology that hews more towards we might call it an apotheosis theology, where Jesus, a guy, remembering in Mark there's no virgin birth, there's no indication, he just pops on the scene during the ministry of John the Baptist and is baptized, and at that point he seems to have a divine mission from there. And we don't have Mark's narrative of a resurrection, so far as we can tell either. That Mark gives an example of a human being who acts with the power of God, but Mark doesn't, I think, lean strongly towards seeing Jesus as divine until perhaps the resurrection, the empty tomb in Mark's case. Matthew, I read Matthew as having a sort of royal Son of God Christology. Matthew's trademark designation for Jesus is Son of David. David as king, David as one who, as traditionally understood in the Psalter, self-identifies as God's son. Psalm 2, the Lord spoke to me, "You are my son, this day have I begotten you." I think Matthew thinks of Jesus as being the divine version of the human royal Son of God that David was. Is this making sense to you?
Yes.
I think that's what the closing scene in Matthew is about, the Great Commission scene. I always love that moment in the Great Commission scene where it says, that he's been raised from death as he told them he would be. They go to Galilee to meet him. He is there where he had said he would be. And it says the disciples worshipped him, but some doubted. And I'm thinking, what does it take to convince that guy? So, well, I'm still not sure. But the unfolding, all authority in heaven and earth has been entrusted to me. Tough to top that. Now, does that make Matthew identify Jesus, the risen Jesus, with God? I think Matthew might not have thought that, but it's as close as effectually wouldn't necessarily make a difference. Luke, I think, has a more he takes elements of Hellenistic philosopher, prophet from the tradition of the traditions of Israel, a witness to the truth to the point of death, weaves them together so as for us as readers to see on the road to Emmaus with the disciples who were kept from perceiving that in fact Jesus is the one who is to redeem Israel. He is more than a prophet, mighty in word and deed before God and all the people, and so on. That the ascension, uniquely narrated in Luke and Acts, is Luke's way of saying he belongs to the celestial realm, and the birth narratives that Luke gives us, much more highly developed and specific even than Matthew's, are his way of saying he's special from the beginning, and in the end we perceive that specialness to have partaken of divinity in some way. There's a fella in the U.S. named J.R. Daniel Kirk, who has made an argument that Jesus is a human being whom God has attested to be the ideal of humanity. This is what a human being, a perfect human being, is. And the Gospels as narratives of what it's like for such a human being to make his way in the world. And I think that, especially in the Synoptic Gospels, there's a lot of force to that argument, in part because we're still within living memory of people who actually walked around with Jesus. And to return to a point that I made earlier, I'm just not convinced we know enough about what it would mean to think that a particular human being with whom you're acquainted was divine. Not just divine in the sense of you look divine or you're amazing, but no, to use the Pauline expression, all the fullness of God dwelt in him. So all the fullness, that's a whole lot of fullness. I can't even imagine all the fullness of God in God, much less all that into a human being. I think that the Synoptics, at least, are trying to imagine that kind of divinity in humanity, but we've been practicing this for 2,000 years now, almost. We're still resorting to metaphor, paraphrase, comparison, and so on and so forth. How much more difficult must it have been to imagine when you were walking along beside him, and you think, oh well, it would be a good thing if he took a shower, wouldn't it, or something like that. If he was fully human, there will have been times when you were more pleased to be around him than others.
Yes.
And to say, that guy with whom I had issues on that day, I think he ate more than his share of the fish. There's no need to take that tone with me, Jesus. To say, he is God. I don't know what the human imagination can do to arrive at that conclusion. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that does. But we see that maybe if we put the Gospel of John aside, there's still a gap present between perhaps the Christology of the Synoptics and maybe even the Gospel of John and later Nicene affirmations.
Oh, sure. It's there was an influential book from the 60s called Trajectories Through Earliest Christianity. Helmut Küster and James M. Robinson. And adopting the terminology, though not necessarily any of the conclusions. I think these are trajectories that we're talking about, and it's the starting point on a trajectory as far as we know. We don't have access to anything before the written texts that we're examining. So I'm entirely comfortable saying this is a correct, for what value that word has in this context, starting point for theological deliberation that ends in the precisions of the conciliar statements. That's fine with me, but that doesn't make the conciliar statements implicit in the starting point.
Yeah.
It's an emergent phenomenon. You don't know from what you see at the start what the developed entity is going to turn out to be.
Yes, yeah. To wrap up with because we've only got not too long left, to wrap up on the Trinity section, sort of, you previously mentioned about the Book of Acts and some of the passages there. How do you view non-gospel books in the New Testament? And I know your expertise is primarily in the New Testament, but also verses such as Isaiah 9 that are used to prophesy the Messiah and his divinity. How do you view those in forming our understanding of?
The Hebrew Bible, I don't believe that anything in the Hebrew Bible was recorded with a view to identifying Jesus hundreds of years later. Right? I don't think Isaiah was saying, and he's going to be, with retrospect, we can say the prophecy that we see, that we read, fits Jesus in a way that doesn't fit anyone else that we can think of nearly so well. Now, obviously, Jewish people don't think that, and they've known God longer than Christians have. So I don't want to get into a tussle about that. But we, as Christians, say, man, that's Jesus. That's the kind of guy Jesus was. But to the extent that we talk about messianic prophecies, and I don't like that because it seems to assume the consequent, right? We identify things as messianic prophecies to the extent that they seem to fit Jesus.
Yes, yeah.
But there are lots of other things that don't fit Jesus particularly, that someone might say, well, that's a messianic prophecy. And I say, well, it can't be because it... Well, no, you don't get to pick and choose the evidence. So I'd much rather say, look, we've got the Hebrew Bible. We've got, in some cases, the really powerful fit between Jesus and texts from the deuterocanonical books, the Septuagint texts that either we don't have in Hebrew or perhaps were never in Hebrew. The passage about the righteous one in that we read on Good Friday in the Book of Wisdom just seems as though it could have been written with Jesus in mind. But it behooves Christians, to my way of thinking, to receive those gratefully without saying Jesus is what they're about. Rather, that these are expressions of God's ways with people, which we, as Christians, see more or less perfectly embodied in, enacted in Jesus and his life. But if my Jewish friends don't see that, fair play. You know, they have a covenant with God. Their understanding is that we crazy Gentiles have latched on to their coattails, and we're a nuisance sometimes. Sometimes we are culpably worse than a nuisance, for which we ought always to be humble and penitent. But it's not up to me to say to the people of Israel, historic Israel, I'm not referring to the nation state, oh man, you don't understand your own scriptures. That would be unthinkable to me. But then to return to the question that you asked, that's how I read the Hebrew Bible and the Greek supplement thereunto. The book of Acts, the later epistles, the early patristic literature, the apostolic fathers, and so on, I take to be, John Wesley used the phrase experimental divinity, and I think I've used with you the language of being a thought experiment. What if we say it this way? I do not think, with St. Irenaeus, that the reason we have 4 Gospels is that there are 4 cardinal points of the compass. That I am unconvinced, St. Irenaeus, and I pray that I'll have the opportunity to understand what he understands at one point, but that just seems to me to be post hoc reasoning that I wouldn't expect anyone to be convinced by. So they're all sort of, hey, I've got an idea. What if it's like this? And of course, the people who are proposing these things think they're right. You think you're right about things. I happen to know that I am. But it's the church extended through time, extended through space around the globe, that discerns what true claims about Jesus are, what true ways of following are, and we identify ourselves with the church or with rejection of the church, with particular expressions of the church over against other possible expressions of the church. And those entail assent to what it means to be among this people. And that sometimes means saying, well, now for someone like me, it might mean saying, in my first book, I said this, but actually, years later, I look back and say, that wasn't. Speaking of the church through history, we might say, well, we used to think that the Epistle of Diognetus was where it's at. But now we see some really anti-Jewish stuff in it that can't be right. And we're not locked into that. The greater testimony of more of the church over more time has been toward greater patience and humility than that text bespeaks. So we can read it, we can appreciate it, we can draw useful Christological insights from it, but we're not bound by it. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. I'd like to, if it's okay with you, just move on to a few questions about your work in hermeneutics.
Yeah.
So, in your view, obviously, can theology still speak normatively in a cultural context shaped by suspicion of meta-narratives and deconstruction?
Well, yeah, I mean, it does. Now, whether it should, that's a separable question. But part of what I've been saying all along has reflected my sense that, on the whole, the church, Christians, have invested in claims about what we can know that go beyond what we can back up. We have a tendency to write checks we can't cash on things we're certain about. It could be just my upbringing that I'm averse to kiting checks. But I think that we stay closer to the truth by being careful about what we claim, by acknowledging the underdetermination of some of the verbal expressions of our faith. Even the creeds don't solve problems for us. They require us to be able to make a plausible connection between, you might say, what we really believe and the verbal formulation. But if you're patient with me, I could probably persuade you that nobody simply, that word's going to do a lot of work, believes what the churches state, what the creeds state. Mm-hmm. There's always a reception and appropriation that is, to some extent, unique to the individual who's affirming the creed. Yeah. So that the church is at its soundest when it is humblest and is working its hardest to take up the mantle of Christ in doing Jesus-y kinds of things, rather than trying to formulate literary articulations of just what those things might be, or just what those beliefs or the rules or whatever might be. Am I getting at the question you're proposing? Because anytime you say, well, this, to take an example from the Hebrew Bible, Hear, O Israel, God is one. The Lord your God, the Lord is one. What does is one mean? Now, you immediately, people will start rolling their eyes, but it's a genuine question, and especially when you read in the rest of the Hebrew Bible, lots of references to other gods. Even St. Paul says, as we know, there are many lords and many gods. Now we can say, well, of course what St. Paul meant was there are many things that people take to be masters, many things that people worship as though they were gods, but they're all wrong. But that's not what he said. When Moses teaches Israel to say, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, or the Lord alone. What is this oneness that is being ascribed? We've got to do work with that. And that dogs any of these expressions. To a great extent, the history of Israel's faith is a succession of arguments about how you live as inheritors of this faith. And to be faithful to this faith, one argues with other participants in it about how best to do it. Christianity is different. We've got this nagging, the psychological term is cathexis, right? There's a felt absence that we need to fill. So we try to put history there, the historical Jesus, that's real. Or we try to put doctrinal statements there. No, he really is fully divine and fully human. Or the Trinity, they are Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but they're not. Like abandoned children, trying to experience parental love that we didn't get as. Now I'm saying, not making this into Christians are abused children who are just working out there, but the energy the more energy we devote to checks we can't cash, saying, no, but really, this check is going to be good on the day of judgment. But it's not much good to you right now, and there are hungry people right now that we could be feeding. That check may be great for you on the day of judgment, but you're still at odds with your sister or your brother in that way. Let's work on reconciling that relationship. Jesus. I'm right about Jesus because historically speaking, this is what he was like. Just let it go. Let it go. Love God, love Jesus, and attend to that characterization of Jesus and God and the Trinity and the Church's faith that you inhabit, that inhabits you. You asked earlier, I'm not sure the tape was running, speaking metaphorically, I know it's all digital, about why I am Anglican rather than Roman Catholic. It's an unanswerable question because I am a child of the Church of England. I am a priest of the Church of England. I can look admiringly across the Tiber and say, that's a lovely way of being. But it doesn't tell the truth about me and my faith
Yeah.
I would be a false version of myself were I to adopt Roman faith, even granted that that's the true faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm of more use to God as the Anglican whom I really am, for better or for worse, than I would be as a newly coined Roman Catholic. This is all I can know, all I can be in the fullness of that verb of being, such as I am. I can be better at it. Heaven knows I could be vastly better at it. But I couldn't, Roman Catholic is a special case because I would be close there, but like I would be a horrible Baptist. I say this without disrespect. I have had Baptist students say, no. As a matter of fact, you're exactly the kind of Baptist I can't imagine that. My daughter-in-law is a Baptist pastor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't presume to be a disciple of Jesus in the Baptist-inflected way that she is. She's brilliant, she's wonderful.
Yeah.
And she is wonderful in a way that's truly Baptist, in a way that I'm not. To my mind, this is a very neutestamentlich, a very biblical, Pauline especially, way of looking at the problem, because the thing St. Paul gets is the extent to which the divine vision is all about the unique capacity of God to render true and beautiful and utterly compelling, not in the sense of compulsory, but in the sense of you've got to acknowledge it, utterly compelling, exquisite unity from all the difference that we make and enforce on one another. I think it's a good thing that I'm as Anglican as I am. I think it's a great thing that Pope Leo is as Roman as he is. And I think it's a wonderful thing that my dear daughter-in-law is as Baptist as she is. And I think it's great that my Jewish friends are as Jewish as they are. And I trust that the Pauline vision is that although you and I may look at this and say, well, that can't work because if you're this, then you can't have that also. And God just says, watch me now. Look at this. Yeah. And you say, as St. Thomas does at the end of John's Gospel, my Lord and my God. I'm quite comfortable with difference in the world on the basis that, in the trust that God knows what's going on and is going to wrap this up more beautifully than I could begin to imagine.
Yes. Yeah. I have one, because I'm aware of a few minutes over, but I have one final question to
Sure.
sort of wrap things up. In an era which we often see that faith is divorced from public reason. How can theology contribute to contemporary debates?
I would say the great way faith can contribute to public debates is by being faithful, not getting suckered into partisan strategic parlaying, but staying with our vocation to bear witness to the truth, in how we deal with things, how we live. The church has gotten out of the work of, in many cases, out of the work of medicine and often of education and reconciliation of people who are hostile to the social order. When those are things that Jesus specifically highlighted as our ways of following him. He was a healer. What are we doing about stepping up to address the gaps left as the NHS is systematically defunded and starved and choked? The church used to be the place for hospitals. And again, by and large, we've ceded that terrain. Education. Oxford and Cambridge were training institutions for clergy. And now theological education scrabbles to hang on. Oriel, excellent theology, just in case you're thinking of applying. We should be doubling down on care for the sick, doubling down on teaching, not necessarily teaching people about the faith. If we're devoting our lives to teaching people out of our faith, people are going to get the idea.
Yes.
We should be working towards kinds of social reconciliation that are not based on revenge and furthering, reinscribing antagonisms between villains and victims, or them and us of any kind, but saying, what do people need such that it's just not in their interest to be inducing old people to give them their life savings, to be threatening people with knives, or just randomly killing, injuring people. We could be doing much more work toward those kinds of goals, more effectually, at least in the sense that the energy that the Church of England devotes to trying to be a power player with Parliament and so on, we're still stuck in the terms set by those social arrangements, whereas we have the opportunity to say, we're just going to help people in these ways. This is what we're going to do. And, you can make rules about it if you want, but we're going to do this. And it'll make the world a better place. And maybe then you might say, well, could you do a little more of it? Thank you very much. We're happy to.
Definitely. Okay, well, I'd like to thank Dr. Adam for coming on to talk about these topics today, and I appreciate your time.
Well, I'm happy to talk about them. As you may have noticed, I'm willing to go on indefinitely on almost any topic. I didn't address nearly all the questions you had proposed that you might raise, but as the Gospel of John says, paraphrased, if you let me talk about all the questions you had raised, then the world itself would not contain the video recordings that would be generated. So probably just as well to cut me off before it's too late. Thank you for your patience, Jack. A pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.